The sun blazed mercilessly across the Texas plains, turning the earth into a cracked canvas of dust and desperation. Sam Henderson wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon that led to his family's ranch. The leather reins felt rough against his calloused hands, hands that had known both the gentle touch needed for healing wounded animals and the firm grip required to defend what was rightfully his. Sam had never considered himself a hero. At 32, he was simply a man trying to make an honest living in a land that seemed determined to test every soul who dared to call it home. His ranch, the Double H, sprawled across 2,000 acres of some of the most challenging terrain in all of Texas. The land was beautiful in its harsh way, with rolling hills that caught the morning light like waves of golden grass, and valleys where wildflowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color against the brown earth. But beauty came with a price in this part of the world. Water was scarce, and what little existed was fiercely protected. Sam's property was blessed with one of the few reliable water sources for miles around, a natural spring that bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small oasis that had sustained his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the first cabin near that spring, and his father had expanded it into a proper ranch house, where Sam now lived with his wife, Elena, and their 8-year-old daughter, Maria. Elena had been the daughter of a Mexican rancher from across the border, and when she married Sam 7 years ago, some folks in the nearby town of Crosswood had raised their eyebrows. But Sam had never cared much for what other people thought, especially when it came to matters of the heart. Elena was the strongest, kindest woman he'd ever known, with eyes that sparkled like stars and a laugh that could chase away the darkest clouds. She spoke 3 languages fluently and could read the weather patterns better than most men twice her age. Little Maria was a perfect blend of both her parents. She had Sam's stubborn determination and Elena's quick wit. The child could ride a horse almost before she could walk properly, and she had an uncanny ability to calm even the most nervous cattle with nothing but her gentle voice and patient movements. Sam often watched her with wonder, marveling at how someone so small could possess such natural grace with animals. The Henderson family had always been known for their generosity. Even in the hardest times, when their own resources were stretched thin, they had never turned away a traveler in need of water or a hot meal. It was a tradition that went back to Sam's grandfather, who had believed that kindness was the only thing that separated civilized folk from the wild animals that roamed the plains. This philosophy was about to be tested in ways Sam could never have imagined. The trouble began on a scorching Tuesday morning in late July. Sam had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to check on the cattle and ensure that the water troughs were full. The spring had been running lower than usual due to the extended drought, but there was still enough to meet their needs and those of the animals. As he walked through the early morning mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers, Sam noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hoofprints. Fresh ones, and plenty of them. Sam knelt beside the muddy bank of the spring and studied the tracks carefully. At least a dozen horses had been here during the night, and from the depth and spacing of the prints, they had been ridden hard by men who knew how to handle themselves in the saddle. More troubling still were the boot prints, the distinctive heel pattern that Sam recognized from wanted posters he'd seen in town. The Dalton Gang. Everyone in 3 counties knew about Jake Dalton and his band of outlaws. They had been terrorizing ranchers and townspeople for over 2 years, stealing cattle, robbing banks, and leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. Jake Dalton himself was a man of legendary cruelty, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a black beard that reached nearly to his chest, and eyes that seemed to hold no warmth whatsoever. His gang consisted of 7 other men, each one meaner than the last, and they moved through the territory like a plague of locusts. What made them particularly dangerous was their knowledge of the land. Jake had grown up in these parts before turning to a life of crime, and he knew every waterhole, every hidden trail, and every place where a man might take shelter from pursuit. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, was a good man, but he was getting old, and his 2 deputies were barely out of their teens. They were no match for seasoned killers like the Dalton Gang. Sam's hands trembled slightly as he realized what this discovery meant. The gang had found a spring, and in this drought-stricken land, water was more valuable than gold. They would be back, and when they came, they wouldn't be interested in sharing. He hurried back to the ranch house, his mind racing with possibilities. Elena was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, and the smell of bacon and coffee should have been comforting. But Sam found it difficult to appreciate such simple pleasures when danger might be lurking just beyond the horizon. "Elena," he called softly, not wanting to wake Maria, who was still sleeping in her small bedroom off the main living area. His wife looked up from the cast-iron skillet where she was cooking eggs, and immediately her expression changed. She had learned to read Sam's moods over the years, and she could tell that something serious was troubling him. "What is it, mi amor?" she asked, setting down her wooden spoon and giving him her full attention. Sam told her about the tracks, about his suspicions regarding the Dalton gang, and about the very real possibility that they might be facing danger in the days to come. Elena listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing more serious with each word. When he finished speaking, Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. Finally, she spoke in her measured, thoughtful way. "We could leave," she said simply. "Pack up our most important belongings and go stay with my cousin in San Antonio until this trouble passes." Sam had already considered this possibility, but something deep inside him rebelled against the idea. This ranch wasn't just his livelihood. It was his heritage, his family's legacy. His grandfather had fought Apache raids to protect this land. His father had survived droughts, floods, and economic hardships without ever giving up. How could Sam be the first Henderson to abandon the Double H when times got difficult? "I can't leave, Elena," he said quietly. "This is our home. This is Maria's inheritance. If we run now, we might never be able to come back." Elena nodded, as if she had expected this answer. She had fallen in love with Sam partly because of his unwavering principles, his refusal to compromise his values, even when it would have been easier to do so. But she was also a practical woman who understood the dangers they faced. "Then, we prepare," she said firmly. "We make sure we're ready for whatever comes." Over the next 3 days, Sam worked feverishly to fortify their position. He cleaned and checked every rifle and pistol on the ranch, making sure they were in perfect working order. He moved extra ammunition into the house and positioned water barrels in strategic locations in case they found themselves under siege. He also sent word to their nearest neighbors, the Crawford family, warning them to be on the lookout for trouble. But even as he made these preparations, Sam found himself hoping that he was wrong, that maybe the tracks belonged to some other group of riders who had simply stopped for water and moved on. Perhaps the Dalton gang was operating in some other part of the territory, and the Double H would remain untouched by their violence. These hopes were shattered on Friday evening. Sam was in the barn, tending to a mare who was about to give birth, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. At first, he thought it might be the Crawford boys coming to check on them, but as the sound grew closer, he realized there were too many riders for it to be a friendly visit. He quickly extinguished the lantern and moved to the barn window, peering out through a gap between the wooden boards. What he saw made his heart sink like a stone thrown into deep water. 8 riders sat motionless on their horses about 50 yards from the ranch house. Even in the fading light, Sam could make out the imposing figure of Jake Dalton at their head, his black hat pulled low over his eyes and his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. The other men spread out in a rough semicircle, effectively surrounding the house and barn. For what seemed like an eternity, nobody moved. The only sounds were the gentle evening breeze rustling through the grass and the soft nickering of horses. Then, Jake Dalton's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Henderson," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We know you're in there. Come out so we can have ourselves a talk." Sam's mouth felt as dry as the dust beneath his feet. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he considered his options. He could try to make a run for the house, but they would surely see him and might start shooting. He could stay hidden in the barn, but that would leave Elena and Maria vulnerable and defenseless. In the end, there was really only one choice he could make. Sam stepped out of the barn, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow and deliberate. He had left his gun belt inside, not wanting to provoke a shootout that he couldn't possibly win. As he walked toward the group of riders, he could feel 8 pairs of eyes watching his every move, like wolves studying their prey. Jake Dalton urged his horse forward a few steps, bringing himself into the circle of light that spilled from the ranch house windows. Up close, he was even more intimidating than Sam had expected. His face was deeply tanned and scarred, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years spent squinting into the sun and too many nights spent planning acts of violence. Mr. Henderson, Dalton said, his voice surprisingly polite. I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. We've been riding hard all day, and we heard you might have some water to spare. Sam looked up at the outlaw leader, trying to keep his voice steady. There's water at the spring, he said simply. You're welcome to take what you need for yourselves and your horses. Dalton smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. That's mighty generous of you, Henderson. Mighty generous indeed. But the thing is, we're not just passing through. We're thinking this might be a good place to rest up for a while. Maybe a week or two, until the heat dies down a bit. The meaning was clear. The gang intended to take over his ranch, to use it as their base of operations while they planned their next series of crimes. Sam felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting angry would only make the situation worse. I've got a wife and daughter, Sam said quietly. They don't deserve to be caught up in whatever trouble you might be running from. For a moment, something flickered across Jake Dalton's face, perhaps a memory of his own family, or maybe just annoyance at being reminded that his actions affected innocent people. But whatever it was, it disappeared quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that had made him such a successful outlaw. I'm sure they're lovely people, Dalton said. And as long as everyone behaves themselves, there's no reason they should come to any harm. We're not monsters, Henderson. We're just businessmen trying to make a living. Sam almost laughed at this description, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. What exactly are you asking of me? Simple, Dalton replied. You provide us with food, water, and shelter for as long as we need it. In return, we don't burn down your house or hurt your family. Seems like a fair trade to me. The other gang members chuckled at their leader's words, clearly enjoying the fear and helplessness they saw in Sam's eyes. But Sam surprised them all by not showing the terror they expected. Instead, he stood straighter and looked Jake Dalton directly in the eye. And what happens when you decide to move on? Sam asked, do you just ride away and leave us in peace? Or do you tie up loose ends? Dalton's smile widened, revealing teeth that were yellowed from years of tobacco and poor care. I like you, Henderson. You're a practical man. Most folks would be begging and crying by now, but you're asking the smart questions. He paused, letting the tension build before continuing. What happens when we leave depends entirely on how cooperative you are while we're here. Treat us right, and we'll treat you right. Give us any trouble, and... He shrugged, leaving the threat unfinished, but clearly understood. Sam nodded slowly, as if accepting the inevitable. But inside his mind, he was already working on a plan. He had no intention of simply submitting to these criminals, but he also couldn't risk a direct confrontation that might get his family killed. He needed to be smart, to find a way to protect Elena and Maria, while also preventing the gang from using his ranch as a base for their criminal activities. All right, Sam said finally, you can water your horses at the spring, and I'll see what we could do about food and shelter. Now, that's the spirit, Dalton said, clearly pleased with what he saw as Sam's surrender. Boys, you heard the man. Let's get these horses watered and see what kind of hospitality the Henderson family has to offer. As the gang members began to dismount and lead their horses toward the spring, Sam felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. He had just invited the devil himself to make camp on his doorstep, and he had no idea how this nightmare was going to end. But as he walked back toward the ranch house to break the terrible news to Elena and Maria, Sam Henderson made a silent promise to himself. He might be outnumbered and outgunned, but he was not beaten. Somehow, someway, he was going to find a way to protect his family and preserve the legacy that his grandfather and father had built with their own sweat and blood. The war for the Double H Ranch was about to begin, and Sam intended to be the last man standing when the dust finally settled. The first 3 days of the Dalton gang's occupation of the Double H Ranch were unlike anything Sam Henderson had ever experienced. It was like living in a twisted version of his normal life, where every routine activity was shadowed by the presence of dangerous men who treated his home as if they owned it. Elena had reacted to the news with the same calm strength that Sam had fallen in love with years ago. When he told her about Dalton's ultimatum, she simply nodded, kissed his forehead gently, and began making preparations to feed 8 additional mouths. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, gathering blankets and setting up sleeping areas in the barn and bunkhouse, never once complaining about the impossible situation they found themselves in. Little Maria, however, was a different story. At 8 years old, she was too young to fully understand the danger they faced, but she was old enough to sense the fear that hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. She stayed close to her parents, speaking in whispers when she spoke at all, and Sam often caught her staring out the windows with wide, frightened eyes. Jake Dalton had established himself as the undisputed ruler of their small domain. He took over Sam's own bedroom, forcing the family to crowd together in Maria's smaller room. The outlaw leader seemed to take particular pleasure in sitting in Sam's favorite chair on the front porch, cleaning his guns while he surveyed the ranch like a king observing his kingdom. The other gang members were spread throughout the property. Two of them, brothers named Pike and Cole Morrison, had claimed the bunkhouse that Sam usually reserved for seasonal workers. They were both in their early 20s, with the kind of reckless cruelty that comes from having nothing left to lose. Pike had been shot in the shoulder during their last robbery, and Elena had been forced to tend to his wound despite her obvious reluctance to help any of these men. Another gang member, a thin, nervous man called Snake Johnson, had set up camp in the barn loft. He seemed to be constantly in motion, always checking the perimeter, always looking over his shoulder as if he expected the law to come riding over the hill at any moment. His constant vigilance made everyone else nervous, including his own companions. The most disturbing member of the gang was a massive man known simply as Bull, who never seemed to speak above a whisper, but whose presence filled any room he entered. Bull had taken a particular interest in Sam's horses, and Sam had to bite his tongue more than once when he saw the giant man handling his prized animals with unnecessary roughness. The remaining 3 gang members, Charlie Red, Doc Henley, and a young Mexican man called Cisco, had divided their time between the various outbuildings and the main house. Doc Henley wasn't actually a doctor, despite his nickname, but he knew enough about treating wounds and illnesses to serve as the gang's unofficial medic. Cisco spoke very little English, communicating mostly with Jake Dalton in rapid Spanish that Elena pretended not to understand, though Sam could tell she was listening to every word. What made the situation particularly unbearable was the constant tension that filled every moment of every day. Sam never knew when one of the outlaws might take offense at some imagined slight, or when their patience with the arrangement might finally run out. He found himself walking on eggshells, carefully considering every word before he spoke, trying to be helpful without appearing too eager to please. The gang's presence was also taking a toll on the ranch's daily operations. The cattle still needed to be fed and watered, the horses still required grooming and exercise, and there were a dozen other tasks that kept a working ranch functioning properly. But with 8 armed men watching his every move, Sam found it difficult to maintain his normal routines. On the second day of the occupation, Sam was mending a section of fence when Jake Dalton approached him, walking with the casual swagger of a man who had never known a moment's doubt about his own power. "You know, Henderson," Dalton said, leaning against a fence post and watching Sam work, "I've been thinking about our arrangement here." Sam kept his focus on the broken fence rail he was trying to repair, but his entire body tensed. When Jake Dalton started thinking, it usually meant trouble for everyone else. "This is a nice spread you've got here," the outlaw continued. "Good water, decent grazing land, far enough from town that a man could conduct his business without too much interference from nosy neighbors." Sam drove a nail into the fence post with more force than necessary, the sound echoing across the quiet pasture. "It's been in my family for 3 generations, he said quietly. "Is that so?" Dalton sounded genuinely interested. "Your grandfather must have been quite a man to carve out a place like this in such wild country." Despite himself, Sam felt a surge of pride. He was fought off Apache raids, survived 2 major droughts, and never once thought about giving up. Dalton nodded appreciatively. "I respect that kind of determination. It takes real strength to build something lasting in a place like this." For a moment, Sam allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Jake Dalton had some shred of human decency buried beneath his outlaw exterior. Maybe he could appeal to whatever remained of the man's conscience. "Then, you understand why I can't just walk away," Sam said, finally, looking up from his work. "This ranch isn't just my home. It's my daughter's future." Dalton's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps calculation, perhaps amusement. "Your daughter. Pretty little thing, isn't she?" The casual way he mentioned Maria sent ice water through Sam's veins. He straightened up slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his hip where his gun would normally hang, before remembering that Dalton had ordered all weapons to be stored in the main house. "She's just a child," Sam said, his voice barely controlled. "Of course she is," Dalton replied smoothly. "And children should be protected, don't you think? Kept safe from all the dangerous things that can happen to innocent folks in this harsh world." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Sam felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. But before he could say something that might provoke a violent response, he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both men turned to see a lone rider approaching the ranch at a steady pace. As the figure drew closer, Sam's heart sank as he recognized Sheriff Tom Bradley, riding his familiar bay gelding and wearing the star that had made him a target for every outlaw in 3 counties. "Looks like you've got company, Henderson," Dalton said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I hope for everyone's sake that you remember where your loyalties lie." Sam watched helplessly as Sheriff Bradley rode into the ranch yard, completely unaware that he was entering what had become an armed camp. Tom Bradley was approaching 60, with gray hair and a lined face that spoke of too many years spent trying to maintain law and order in a lawless land. He had been a friend of Sam's father, and he had known Sam since he was Maria's age. "Morning, Sam," the sheriff called out cheerfully as he dismounted near the front porch. "Thought I'd stop by and check on you folks. Been hearing some troubling reports about strangers in the area." Sam felt Dalton's eyes burning into him as he walked toward the sheriff, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle this deadly situation. If he warned the sheriff about the gang's presence, shooting would almost certainly break out, and Elena and Maria could be caught in the crossfire. But if he said nothing, he would be allowing a good man to walk into a trap. "Sheriff Bradley," Sam said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "What brings you out this way?" The older man tied his horse to the hitching post and removed his hat, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a faded bandana. "Well, Sam, I've been tracking the Dalton gang for the better part of a week. Lost their trail somewhere near Devil's Canyon, but I found signs that they might have headed this direction." Sam's blood turned to ice as he realized that Sheriff Bradley had just announced his own death warrant. From the corner of his eye, he could see movement in the ranch house windows as the gang members took positions. "Haven't seen any strangers around here, Sheriff," Sam lied, hating himself for the deception, but seeing no alternative. "Just been going about our normal business." Sheriff Bradley studied Sam's face carefully, and, for a moment, Sam was afraid that the older man's years of experience had allowed him to detect the lie. Tom Bradley had survived as a lawman for over 20 years by learning to read people, and Sam had never been particularly good at hiding his emotions. "That's good to hear," the sheriff said finally, but Sam could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Mind if I water my horse at your spring? It's been a long, hot ride." Before Sam could answer, Jake Dalton stepped around the corner of the house, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. He had somehow managed to strap on his gun belt without Sam noticing, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his Colt .45. "Sheriff Bradley," Dalton said, his voice carrying a mocking politeness. "What a pleasant surprise." The sheriff's reaction was immediate and instinctive. His hand flew to his own weapon, but he was an old man facing a gunfighter in his prime. Dalton's pistol cleared leather with lightning speed, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoing across the quiet ranch yard. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff," Dalton said calmly. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, and there are innocent folks here who might get hurt if you decide to play the hero." Sheriff Bradley's hand froze on his gun handle as he took in the situation. Other gang members had emerged from their hiding places, all of them armed and ready for violence. The sheriff was clearly trapped, but Sam could see the wheels turning in the older man's mind as he considered his options. "Jake Dalton," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice steady despite the impossible odds he faced. "Should have known you'd turn up eventually. Been looking forward to our next meeting." Dalton chuckled, clearly enjoying the sheriff's predicament. "Have you now? Well, here I am. Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" For what seemed like an eternity, the two men stared at each other across the dusty ranch yard, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Sam felt completely helpless, caught between his desire to protect an innocent man and his need to keep his family safe. Then, without warning, Sheriff Bradley slowly raised his hands above his head, his fingers moving away from his gun. "Seems like you boys have gotten the drop on me," he said, his voice carrying a resignation that broke Sam's heart. I suppose there's no shame in admitting when a man's beaten. Dalton's smile widened, clearly savoring his victory over the lawman who had been pursuing him for so long. Smart man. I always did respect practical thinking. He gestured to two of his men, who moved forward to disarm the sheriff and tie his hands behind his back. As they roughly handled the older man, Sam felt a surge of anger that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Sheriff Bradley had done nothing wrong except try to do his job, and now he was going to pay the ultimate price for his dedication to the law. What are you planning to do with him? Sam asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Dalton considered the question for a moment, as if he were genuinely weighing his options. Well, that depends on the sheriff here. Tom, can I call you Tom? You've been chasing me and my boys for quite some time now. Cost us money, cost us sleep, generally made our lives more difficult than they needed to be. Sheriff Bradley met the outlaw's gaze without flinching. Just doing my job, Dalton. I'm sure you were. But the thing is, Tom, your job is causing problems for my job. And I can't have that. Dalton walked slowly around the bound sheriff, like a wolf circling wounded prey. Now, I could shoot you right here and be done with it. Would be the simplest solution, and I'll admit there's a part of me that finds the idea appealing. Sam felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he listened to this casual discussion of murder. He looked toward the house and saw Elena standing in the doorway, her face pale with terror as she watched the scene unfolding in their front yard. But Dalton continued, I'm not an unreasonable man. So I'm going to make you a deal, Tom. You give me your word that you'll stop chasing me and my boys, that you'll tell everyone back in town that you lost our trail and have no idea where we went, and I'll let you ride away from here. Sheriff Bradley was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the impossible choice he'd been given. Sam could see the conflict playing out on the older man's weathered features, his sense of duty warring with his desire to survive. And if I refuse, the sheriff asked quietly. Dalton shrugged. Then I'll kill you right here, and your deputies will never know what happened to you. Your wife will spend the rest of her life wondering if you're still alive somewhere, and your grandchildren will grow up without ever really knowing what kind of man their grandfather was. The cruelty of this psychological torture was almost more than Sam could bear. Jake Dalton wasn't just threatening to kill Sheriff Bradley. He was threatening to rob the man of his legacy, to ensure that his sacrifice would be meaningless. Sheriff Bradley closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, Sam could see that he had made his decision. I can't do that, Dalton, he said quietly. I took an oath to protect the innocent and uphold the law. I can't just walk away from that because it's convenient. Sam felt a mixture of admiration and despair at the sheriff's words. Tom Bradley was choosing to die rather than compromise his principles, and while Sam respected the man's courage, he also knew that this stubborn nobility was about to get him killed. Dalton nodded, as if he had expected this response. I figured you might say that, Tom. Can't say I don't respect it, in a way. Takes guts to choose death over compromise. He drew his pistol again and pointed it directly at the sheriff's chest. Any last words, lawman? Sheriff Bradley straightened his shoulders and looked Dalton directly in the eye. Yeah, when you boys are all dead or behind bars, I want you to remember that I told you it would end that way. Dalton's finger began to tighten on the trigger, and Sam knew that he was about to witness a cold-blooded murder. But just as the outlaw leader was about to fire, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Wait! Everyone turned to see Elena walking across the ranch yard, carrying a wooden bucket filled with cool water from the spring. She moved with quiet dignity, her head held high despite the fear that Sam knew must be coursing through her veins. The sheriff's horse needs water, she said simply, as if armed standoffs were a normal part of her daily routine. It would be wrong to let an innocent animal suffer because of the conflicts between men. Jake Dalton stared at her in surprise, clearly not having expected this interruption. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure seemed to slip, revealing something almost human beneath the outlaw exterior. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there when he spoke to Sam or the sheriff. This isn't really any of your concern. Elena set the bucket down near Sheriff Bradley's horse and turned to face Dalton with the same calm strength she had shown throughout this entire nightmare. Any suffering that happens on our land is our concern, she said quietly. That's what my husband's grandfather believed, what his father believed, and what we believe. We don't turn away from those in need, regardless of the circumstances. She paused, her dark eyes moving from Dalton to the sheriff and back again. "If you're going to kill this man, that's between you and God. But I won't stand by and watch his horse suffer from thirst." The simplicity and dignity of her words seemed to catch everyone off guard. Even the hardened outlaws seemed affected by Elena's quiet courage, and Sam felt a surge of love and pride for his wife that was so strong it almost brought tears to his eyes. Jake Dalton studied Elena's face for a long moment, and Sam could see something shifting in the outlaw's expression. Finally, he holstered his gun and stepped back. "You know what, Tom?" he said to the sheriff. "Today's your lucky day. This lady here just reminded me that even outlaws can have a sense of hospitality." He gestured to his men, who reluctantly lowered their weapons. "Cut him loose." Sheriff Bradley looked as surprised as everyone else as the ropes fell away from his wrists. He rubbed his chafed skin and looked from Elena to Dalton, clearly trying to understand what had just happened. "I'm letting you go, lawman," Dalton said, "but not because I'm going soft. I'm doing it because this lady showed me that there's still some decency left in this world, and maybe that deserves to be respected." He stepped closer to the sheriff, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But if I see you again, Tom, if you come after me and my boys, I won't be so generous next time." "Understood." Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly, still clearly confused by this unexpected turn of events. He walked to his horse, which was gratefully drinking from the bucket Elena had provided, and mounted slowly. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "I'm in your debt." As the sheriff rode away, Sam found himself looking at his wife with new eyes. Elena had just saved a man's life through nothing more than simple human kindness and moral courage. In a world that seemed increasingly dominated by violence and cruelty, she had reminded everyone present that there were still people who believed in doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. But Sam also knew that this reprieve was only temporary. The Dalton gang was still camped on his land, still using his home as their base of operations. And now they had been reminded that law enforcement was actively searching for them. The war for the Double H Ranch was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The aftermath of Sheriff Bradley's unexpected release brought in strange quiet to the Double H Ranch. For the rest of that day and into the evening, even the normally boisterous gang members seemed subdued, as if Elena's simple act of kindness had reminded them of something they had forgotten about themselves, or perhaps something they had never known existed. Jake Dalton spent most of the evening sitting alone on the front porch, smoking cigarettes and staring out into the darkness. Sam watched him from the kitchen window as Elena prepared a late dinner, wondering what thoughts were running through the outlaw leader's mind. The man seemed genuinely troubled by what had happened, though Sam couldn't begin to guess whether that was a good thing or a bad thing for his family's future. Elena herself seemed changed by the day's events. There was a new confidence in the way she moved around the house, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. She had faced down 8 armed criminals and saved a man's life, and Sam could see that she understood, perhaps for the first time, just how powerful simple human decency could be, even in the face of overwhelming evil. Little Maria, however, remained confused and frightened by everything that was happening around her. She had watched from her bedroom window as the confrontation unfolded, and though she didn't fully understand what she had seen, she knew that something terrible had almost happened. She stayed close to her parents throughout the evening, speaking only in whispers and jumping at every unexpected sound. As the family prepared for bed in their cramped quarters, Sam pulled Elena aside for a quiet conversation. "What you did today," he said softly, "that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Elena looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I couldn't just stand there and watch them kill that poor man. Not on our land, not in front of our daughter." "I know," Sam replied, taking her hands in his. "But, Elena, you need to understand that what happened today might have consequences. Dalton let the sheriff go because you asked him to, but that doesn't mean he's suddenly become a good man. If anything, he might be angry that you made him look weak in front of his men." Elena nodded hashfully. "I've been thinking about that. But, Sam, I also think today showed us something important. These men aren't monsters, not completely. They're still human beings, which means they can still be reached. They can still be changed." Sam wanted to share his wife's optimism, but he had seen too much of the world's darkness to believe that evil could be so easily transformed. Still, he couldn't deny that Jake Dalton's behavior had been completely unexpected. Maybe Elena was right. Maybe there was still hope for a peaceful resolution to their nightmare. These hopes were tested the very next morning. Sam woke before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to begin his daily chores. The air was cool and fresh, with just a hint of the heat that would soon make the day unbearable. For a moment, he allowed himself to pretend that everything was normal, that his biggest concern was whether the cattle had enough water and whether the fence repairs would hold through another season. But as he walked toward the barn, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Bull, the massive gang member who had claimed the barn loft as his sleeping quarters, was lying motionless on the ground near the water trough. At first, Sam thought the man might simply be sleeping off a night of heavy drinking, but as he drew closer, he could see that something was seriously wrong. Bull's face was flushed and covered with sweat, despite the cool morning air. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when Sam knelt beside him, he could feel the heat radiating from the man's body like warmth from a forge. "Hey," Sam said quietly, gently shaking Bull's shoulder. "Hey, wake up." The big man's eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy and unfocused. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak before his eyes rolled back, and he lost consciousness again. Sam had seen enough sick cattle and horses to recognize the symptoms. Bull was running a dangerously high fever, and from the look of things, he had been fighting whatever illness had taken hold of him for several hours. If he didn't get help soon, he might not survive the day. For a moment, Sam found himself facing a terrible moral dilemma. This man was part of the gang that had invaded his home and threatened his family. Bull had shown no kindness or mercy to any of them, and had in fact seemed to take particular pleasure in intimidating Maria whenever their paths crossed. By any reasonable standard, Sam owed him nothing. But as he looked down at the suffering man, Sam heard his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. "Kindness ain't about what folks deserve, boy. It's about what kind of person you choose to be." Sam made his decision quickly, before he could change his mind. He hurried back to the house and woke Elena, explaining the situation in hushed tones so as not to wake Maria. "He's burning up with fever," Sam whispered. "If we don't do something soon, he's going to die." Elena didn't hesitate. She immediately began gathering the supplies she would need: clean cloth for cooling compresses, willow bark tea for the fever, and various herbs from her small garden that might help fight whatever infection had taken hold of the big man. Together, they managed to move Bull into the barn, where Elena could tend to him more effectively. It was difficult work. The man was enormous, easily weighing well over 200 pounds, and his fever made him delirious and uncooperative. But Elena worked with the same gentle efficiency she had always shown when caring for sick animals, and gradually Bull's condition began to stabilize. It was Jake Dalton who found them there an hour later. He had come looking for his missing gang member and discovered Sam and Elena working together to save Bull's life. For a long moment, the outlaw leader stood in the barn doorway, watching as Elena placed cool, wet cloths on Bull's forehead while Sam held the semi-conscious man steady. "What's wrong with him?" Dalton asked, his voice unusually subdued. "Some kind of fever," Elena replied without looking up from her patient. "Could be from bad water, could be something he ate, could be any number of things. But if we can keep his temperature down and get some medicine into him, he should recover." Dalton stepped closer, studying his companion's flushed face with what might have been genuine concern. "Bull's been with me for 3 years. Saved my life more than once. The outlaw paused, as if surprised by his own emotion. "He's about the closest thing I've got to a friend." Sam looked up from where he was supporting Bull's shoulders. "Your friend is going to be fine, but only if we can keep him cool and get him to take some of this willow bark tea." Elena knows what she's doing. For the next several hours, the three of them worked together in an atmosphere that was unlike anything Sam could have imagined. Jake Dalton, the feared leader of one of the most dangerous gangs in Texas, sat patiently beside his friend, helping to hold him steady while Elena administered her remedies. The outlaw asked intelligent questions about Bull's treatment and followed Elena's instructions without question or complaint. It was during one of these quiet moments that Dalton finally spoke about what was really on his mind. "Yesterday," he said, not looking at either Sam or Elena, "what your wife did, that was—" He struggled for the right words. "I ain't used to people showing kindness to folks who don't deserve it." Elena paused in her work, glancing at the outlaw leader with something that might have been pity. "Everyone deserves kindness, Mr. Dalton. That's what makes us human." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. I haven't been human for a long time, ma'am. Lost that somewhere along the way. No, Elena said firmly. You didn't lose it. It's still there. You showed it yesterday when you let the sheriff go, and you're showing it now by caring about your friend. Sam watched this exchange with fascination and growing hope. Elena was doing something that he had thought was impossible. She was reaching the man beneath the outlaw, reminding Jake Dalton of whatever goodness might still exist in his heart. As the day wore on, Bull's condition gradually improved. The fever broke around midday, and by evening he was conscious and able to take some broth that Elena had prepared. He was still weak and disoriented, but it was clear that he was going to recover. It was then that Jake Dalton made an announcement that surprised everyone. We're moving on, he told his gathered gang members as they stood around Bull's makeshift sickbed in the barn. Tonight, as soon as Bull's strong enough to ride. The other outlaws looked at their leader in surprise. Pike Morrison, the younger of the two brothers, was the first to voice their confusion. But boss, this is a perfect hideout. Good water, plenty of space, far from town. Why would we leave? Dalton's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sam thought he might lash out at his subordinate for questioning his decision. But instead, the outlaw leader simply shook his head. Because it's time, he said simply, we've worn out our welcome. Snake Johnson, the nervous man who had been constantly watching for signs of pursuit, stepped forward with his own concerns. Jake, if we leave now, where are we going to go? The law is still looking for us, and we don't have any other safe places lined up. We'll figure that out when we get there, Dalton replied curtly. Pack up your gear. We ride at midnight. As the gang members reluctantly began to gather their belongings, Dalton pulled Sam aside for a private conversation. Henderson, he said quietly, I want you to know that what you and your wife did for Bull, well, that's not something I'll forget. Sam nodded, not sure how to respond to this unexpected gratitude from a man he had been taught to fear. There's something else, Dalton continued. The reason we came here in the first place wasn't just because of your water source. We've been planning to rob the bank in Crosswood, and this ranch was supposed to be our staging ground. Sam felt a chill run down his spine at this revelation. The gang hadn't just been looking for a place to hide. They had been planning another crime that would have brought more violence and suffering to innocent people. But Dalton said, his voice taking on a strange tone, I've decided we're going to skip Crosswood. Find some other target, in some other territory. Why? Sam asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. Dalton was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening sky. Because your wife was right about something yesterday. There are still decent people in this world, and they don't deserve to suffer because of the choices I've made. He turned to look directly at Sam, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Sam saw something other than coldness in the outlaw's eyes. You've got a good woman, Henderson, and a beautiful daughter. Don't ever take that for granted. As midnight approached, the Dalton gang prepared to leave the Double H Ranch. Bull was still weak, but able to sit a horse, and the other gang members had packed their gear with the efficiency of men who had been running from the law for years. Jake Dalton was the last to mount his horse. Before he did, he walked over to where Sam, Elena, and Maria stood on the front porch, watching the outlaws prepare to depart. Mrs. Henderson, he said, removing his hat respectfully, I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my friend's life, and he paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man like him. You reminded me that I used to be better than this. Elena stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, extended her hand to the outlaw leader. Everyone can change, Mr. Dalton. It's never too late to choose a different path. Dalton looked down at her outstretched hand for a moment before reaching out and shaking it gently. Maybe you're right, ma'am. Maybe it's not too late. He turned to Sam and nodded once man to man. Take care of your family, Henderson. This is a good place, and you're good people. Don't let the world change that. And with that, Jake Dalton swung into his saddle and led his gang away from the Double H Ranch, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts returning to whatever hell had spawned them. Sam stood on his front porch with his arm around Elena's shoulders, watching the outlaws ride away. Maria pressed close against his other side, finally able to speak in a normal voice for the first time in a week. Are they really gone, Papa? She asked quietly. Yes, sweetheart, Sam replied, his voice thick with emotion. They're really gone. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, Sam found himself thinking about what had just happened. A week ago, he had been a simple rancher trying to make an honest living. Now, he felt as though he had witnessed something profound, the power of simple human kindness to reach even the darkest hearts and change the course of events that had seemed inevitable. Elena had been right all along. The men of the Dalton gang weren't monsters, not completely. They were human beings who had lost their way. And through patience, compassion, and unexpected generosity, she had managed to remind their leader of whatever goodness still remained in his soul. But Sam also knew that this story was far from over. Jake Dalton and his gang were still outlaws, still dangerous men who lived outside the law. Their departure from the Double H Ranch didn't erase their crimes or guarantee that they wouldn't commit more in the future. What it did prove, however, was that even in the darkest circumstances, even when faced with seemingly impossible odds, the simple act of treating others with kindness and dignity could have consequences that no one could predict. As the Henderson family finally went inside their house, their home, which truly belonged to them once again, Sam made a silent promise. He would never forget the lessons of the past week. He would remember that enemies could become allies, that kindness was stronger than fear, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon a person could wield was simple human decency. The war for the Double H Ranch was over, but the story of what had happened there was just beginning to spread across the territory, carrying with it a message of hope that would be remembered long after the last of the outlaws had been brought to justice. 3 months had passed since the Dalton gang rode away from the Double H Ranch, and life had slowly returned to something resembling normal. The autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, and Sam Henderson found himself grateful for the changing seasons in a way he had never experienced before. Each sunrise felt like a gift, each peaceful day a reminder of how precious ordinary life could be. The story of what had happened at their ranch had spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Sheriff Bradley had been true to his word about keeping the details of his encounter with Jake Dalton to himself, but he couldn't resist sharing the tale of Elena Henderson's courage and the unexpected mercy it had inspired. Soon, people were traveling from neighboring counties just to meet the woman who had faced down the most feared outlaw in Texas and lived to tell about it. Elena had become something of a legend herself, though she remained uncomfortable with the attention. Visitors would arrive at the ranch asking to hear the story firsthand, and Elena would politely tell them what had happened while Sam served coffee and Maria hid behind her mother's skirts. The little girl was still easily startled by strangers, a lingering effect of their terrifying week with the gang. But it wasn't just curious visitors who found their way to the Double H Ranch. Word had also spread about Elena's skill as a healer, and people began bringing their sick animals and sometimes even their sick children for her care. She never turned anyone away, and she never accepted payment for her help, believing that healing was a gift meant to be shared freely. Sam had initially worried about Elena's growing reputation. He feared that it might attract the wrong kind of attention, or that people might come expecting miracles that she couldn't provide. But as he watched his wife tend to a rancher's injured horse or help a neighbor's child recover from fever, he began to understand that this was simply who Elena had always been. The encounter with the Dalton gang hadn't changed her. It had simply revealed the strength and compassion that had been there all along. The ranch itself was thriving. The autumn rains had been plentiful, refilling the spring and providing enough water to last through the winter months. The cattle were healthy and well-fed, and Sam had been able to complete all the repairs and improvements that he had been putting off for months. There was a sense of prosperity and peace about the place that he had never quite felt before. But on a cold morning in late November, their peaceful existence was shattered by an unexpected visitor. Sam was in the barn, preparing feed for the horses, when he heard the sound of a single rider approaching the ranch. He had learned to be cautious about unexpected guests, and he moved quickly to the barn door to get a look at whoever was coming up the path. What he saw nearly stopped his heart. The rider was slumped forward in his saddle, barely able to stay mounted. Even from a distance, Sam could see that the man was badly injured. His clothes were torn and bloody, and his horse was limping badly, suggesting that both rider and mount had been through some terrible ordeal. As the figure drew closer, Sam felt a shock of recognition that hit him like a physical blow. It was Bull, the massive gang member whom Elena had nursed back to health just 3 months earlier. Sam's first instinct was to run for his rifle, but something about the man's condition gave him pause. Bull was clearly in no shape to threaten anyone. He could barely sit upright in his saddle, much less pose a danger to Sam's family. Whatever had happened to him, he was in desperate need of help. Elena must have seen the approaching rider from the house, because she came running across the ranch yard just as Bull's horse stumbled to a halt near the front porch. The big man tried to dismount, but his strength failed him and he collapsed to the ground with a groan of pain. "My God," Elena breathed as she knelt beside the wounded outlaw. "What happened to you?" Bull's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at Elena with a mixture of desperation and shame. "Mrs. Henderson," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know where else to go." Sam approached cautiously, still not entirely trusting the situation despite Bull's obvious weakness. "Where are the others? Where's Dalton?" Bull's face twisted with pain that seemed to go beyond his physical injuries. "Dead," he said flatly. "Most of them, anyway. Jake Pike, Doc Henley, all dead." Elena was already examining Bull's wounds, her healer's instincts overriding any fear or suspicion she might have felt. Sam could see bullet holes in the man's shirt and jacket, and there was a particularly nasty-looking gash on his left arm that was still bleeding freely. "Sam, help me get him inside," Elena said firmly. "He's lost a lot of blood." Sam hesitated for just a moment, torn between his protective instincts and his trust in his wife's judgment. But when he saw the look in Elena's eyes, the same determined compassion she had shown when Bull was sick with fever, he knew that she was right. Whatever this man had done in the past, whatever crimes he might be guilty of, right now, he was simply a human being in need of help. Together, they managed to help Bull into the house and onto the couch in their main living area. Elena immediately began cleaning his wounds while Sam stood guard, still unsure whether this might be some kind of trap. "Tell us what happened," Elena said as she worked, her voice gentle but insistent. "Who did this to you?" Bull closed his eyes, clearly struggling with painful memories as well as his physical injuries. "Bounty hunters," he said finally. "3 of them, led by a man called Carson Reed. They tracked us to a canyon about 50 miles north of here." Sam knew the name Carson Reed by reputation. He was a former lawman who had turned to bounty hunting after losing his badge for using excessive force. Reed was known for bringing in his targets dead rather than alive, claiming that it was safer for everyone involved. "We never had a chance," Bull continued, his voice growing stronger as Elena's ministrations seemed to ease his pain. "They had us surrounded before we even knew they were there. Started shooting without warning, no attempt to take us alive." He paused, wincing as Elena cleaned a particularly deep wound on his shoulder. Jake tried to surrender, threw down his gun, and put his hands up. "Reed shot him anyway. Said dead outlaws don't cause any more trouble." Sam felt a strange mix of emotions at this news. Jake Dalton had been a criminal, a man who had threatened Sam's family and terrorized innocent people throughout the territory. By any reasonable standard, justice had been served. But Sam couldn't forget the humanity he had seen in Dalton during those final moments at the ranch, the hint of redemption that Elena's kindness had awakened in the outlaw leader's heart. "How did you get away?" Sam asked. Bull's expression darkened. "Cisco and me, we were the only ones who made it out of that canyon. But Cisco, he didn't make it much further. Took a bullet in the lung. I stayed with him as long as I could, but he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence." Elena looked up from her work, her eyes filled with compassion. "You try to help your friend. That shows the kind of man you really are." Bull stared at her in surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Ma'am, I'm an outlaw. I've done terrible things. I don't deserve your kindness." "That's not for you to decide," Elena replied firmly. "And it's not for me to decide either. Kindness isn't about what people deserve. It's about what we choose to give." As Elena continued to tend to Bull's wounds, the big man began to tell them more about what had happened after the gang left the Double H Ranch. According to his account, Jake Dalton had indeed kept his word about not robbing the bank in Crosswood. Instead, the gang had traveled north, apparently looking for a way to start over somewhere far from their criminal past. But the life of an outlaw wasn't something that could be easily escaped. Other criminals had heard about their reputation and had approached them about joining various schemes. Law enforcement agencies throughout the territory were still actively hunting them, and bounty hunters like Carson Reed were always looking to make a profit from their capture. Jake was trying to change, Bull said, his voice filled with genuine sadness. "After what happened here, after what you folks showed us, he was really trying to be better, but the world wouldn't let him." This revelation hit Sam harder than he had expected. He had hoped that Jake Dalton might find a way to redeem himself, to use the glimpse of humanity that Elena had shown him as a foundation for building a better life. To learn that the outlaw leader had died while trying to change, gunned down by a bounty hunter who saw him as nothing more than a source of income, seemed like a particularly cruel twist of fate. "What about you?" Elena asked as she finished bandaging Bull's wounds. "What are you going to do now?" Bull was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the ceiling as if the answer might be written there. "I don't know, ma'am. The gang's gone, most of my friends are dead, and I'm probably still wanted by the law. Don't seem like I've got many options left." Sam found himself studying the big man's face, looking for some sign of the menacing presence that had once terrorized his family. But all he saw now was a broken, lonely human being who seemed genuinely lost and confused about his place in the world. "There's always a choice," Elena said quietly. "You could turn yourself in, serve your time, and start over with a clean slate." Bull laughed bitterly. "They'd hang me for sure, Mrs. Henderson. I've got too much blood on my hands for them to show mercy." "Maybe," Elena agreed, "but maybe not. And even if they did, wouldn't it be better to die as a man trying to do right than to live as someone running from his past?" This conversation continued for several hours as Elena finished treating Bull's injuries, and Sam prepared some food for their unexpected guest. Despite his wariness, Sam found himself genuinely interested in what the outlaw had to say about Jake Dalton's final months and his apparent attempt at redemption. It was late in the afternoon when another rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a steady but unhurried pace. This time, Sam recognized the figure immediately. It was Sheriff Bradley, riding his familiar bay gelding and wearing the same determined expression he had worn during his previous visit to the Double H Ranch. Sam felt his heart sink as he realized the implications. If the sheriff was here, it probably meant that he had been tracking Bull's trail. The wounded outlaw would be arrested, and Sam and Elena might find themselves in trouble for harboring a fugitive. Bull must have seen the approaching lawman as well, because he struggled to sit up on the couch, his face pale with fear and resignation. "I won't bring trouble to your house," he said quietly. "I'll go outside and surrender peacefully." Elena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, keeping him seated. "You're not strong enough to walk, much less run, and we're not going to let you face this alone." Sam nodded in agreement, despite his own concerns about the legal ramifications of their actions. "Elena's right. You came to us for help, and we're not going to abandon you now." Sheriff Bradley dismounted near the front porch and approached the house with the same careful caution he had shown during his previous visit. But when Sam opened the door to meet him, the older lawman's expression was more tired than threatening. "Afternoon, Sam," Sheriff Bradley said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "I can guess," Sam replied. "But before you do anything, Sheriff, you should know that this man is badly wounded and has been nothing but peaceful since he arrived." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "I heard about the shootout with Carson Reed. Terrible business that. Reed brought in 4 bodies, claimed they were all members of the Dalton gang. But we knew there had been more of them, so I've been following the trail of the survivors." He paused, looking past Sam toward the interior of the house. "How badly is he hurt?" "Bad enough," Sam replied honestly. "My wife has been tending to his wounds, but he's lost a lot of blood. He's not going anywhere on his own." Sheriff Bradley considered this information for a moment before making an unexpected decision. "Mind if I come in and have a word with him? I promise there won't be any violence." Sam stepped aside to let the sheriff enter, and together they walked into the main living area where Bull was resting under Elena's care. The big outlaw looked up at the lawman with resignation, but no hostility. "Sheriff," Bull said simply, "I suppose you're here to arrest me." "That depends," Sheriff Bradley replied, settling into a chair across from the couch. "I'm here to ask you some questions about what happened up north. Carson Reed's story doesn't quite add up, and I'd like to hear your side of things." What followed was one of the most remarkable conversations Sam had ever witnessed. Sheriff Bradley questioned Bull about the shootout with the bounty hunters, about Jake Dalton's state of mind in the weeks before his death, and about the gang's activities during their final months. Bull answered honestly, holding nothing back, even when his responses implicated him in various crimes. But what emerged from this questioning was a picture of Jake Dalton's genuine attempts at redemption, his efforts to lead his remaining followers away from their criminal past, and the tragic circumstances that had led to their violent end. "Reed didn't give us any chance to surrender," Bull concluded. "He wanted us dead from the start. said it was cleaner that way, less paperwork. Sheriff Bradley's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened to this account. Carson Reed's methods had always been questionable, but if Bull's story was true, the bounty hunter had essentially committed murder. I'll need to investigate Reed's actions, the sheriff said finally. In the meantime, I'm placing you under arrest, but you'll be staying here until you're well enough to travel. Mrs. Henderson, I'm officially asking you to continue caring for this man as my prisoner. Elena looked surprised, but pleased by this arrangement. Of course, Sheriff. I'll do whatever I can to help him recover. As Sheriff Bradley prepared to leave, he pulled Sam aside for a private conversation. Sam, I want you to know that what you and Elena are doing here, what's exactly the kind of thing this territory needs more of. There's too much hatred and violence in this world. Sometimes it takes ordinary folks showing extraordinary kindness to remind the rest of us what really matters. After the sheriff left, Sam found himself sitting on the front porch as the sun set over the Texas plains, thinking about the strange turn their lives had taken. In the span of just a few months, they had gone from being victims of outlaw violence to being the unlikely guardians of the last surviving member of the gang that had terrorized them. But as he looked through the window and saw Elena patiently helping Bull take some soup, Sam realized that this wasn't really strange at all. This was simply who they were, who they had always been. They were people who believed that every human being deserved compassion, regardless of their past mistakes or current circumstances. The story of the Double H Ranch was far from over, but Sam was beginning to understand that it was becoming something much larger than just the tale of one family's encounter with dangerous outlaws. It was becoming a symbol of the power of mercy, forgiveness, and the human capacity for change. 6 months later, the Double H Ranch had become something that Sam Henderson could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. What had once been a simple cattle operation had transformed into a place of hope and healing that drew visitors from across the entire Southwest. Bull, whose real name turned out to be William Bull Matthews, had recovered completely from his wounds and had chosen to remain at the ranch rather than flee to some distant territory. The big man had voluntarily surrendered to Sheriff Bradley and had been sentenced to 5 years of supervised work at the Double H, essentially making him Sam's responsibility. It was an unusual arrangement, but one that seemed to be working better than anyone had expected. Bull had proven to be an incredibly hard worker, applying his considerable physical strength to projects around the ranch that Sam had been putting off for years. He had rebuilt the entire barn roof, constructed new corrals that were stronger than anything Sam could have built himself, and had even helped dig a new well that provided additional water during the dry seasons. But more importantly, Bull had undergone a transformation that was nothing short of remarkable. The sullen, intimidating outlaw who had once terrorized the Henderson family had been replaced by a gentle giant who spoke softly, worked tirelessly, and showed particular kindness to animals and children. Maria, who had once hidden from him in terror, now considered him something like a beloved uncle, often following him around the ranch as he went about his daily tasks. Elena's reputation as a healer had continued to grow, and people now traveled hundreds of miles to bring their sick family members and animals to the Double H Ranch. She had established a small clinic in one of the outbuildings, and with Bull's help, she had created facilities that could accommodate visitors who needed to stay for extended treatment. What made the ranch truly special, however, wasn't just Elena's medical skills. It was the atmosphere of acceptance and redemption that seemed to permeate every aspect of life there. Word had spread throughout the territory that the Double H was a place where people could find help regardless of their past mistakes or current circumstances. Former outlaws, displaced families, injured travelers, and anyone else who found themselves in need of assistance knew that they would be welcomed with open arms. Sam had initially worried about the financial implications of Elena's generosity. Caring for so many people required resources that a simple cattle ranch couldn't easily provide. But somehow, the money always seemed to appear when it was needed most. Grateful visitors left donations, neighboring ranchers contributed supplies, and local merchants often provided goods at cost or even for free. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. There had been several occasions when former criminals had arrived at the ranch with less than honorable intentions, hoping to take advantage of the Hendersons' well-known kindness. But Bull's imposing presence and reformed outlook had proven to be an effective deterrent. Word quickly spread through the outlaw community that the Double H Ranch was under the protection of Big Bill Matthews, and that anyone who caused trouble there would have to answer to him personally. It was on a warm spring morning, almost exactly 1 year after the Dalton gang's first arrival at the ranch, that Sam received a visitor who would change everything once again. He was working in the vegetable garden that Elena had expanded to help feed their many guests when he noticed a lone rider approaching from the east. The figure was still too distant to make out clearly, but there was something about the way the person sat their horse that struck Sam as familiar. As the rider drew closer, Sam felt his heart begin to race with recognition and disbelief. The approaching figure was a woman, riding side saddle with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years in the saddle. She was dressed in traveling clothes that had once been elegant, but now showed the wear of a long, difficult journey. And her face. Sam dropped his gardening tools and ran toward the approaching rider, hardly daring to believe what his eyes were telling him. "Margaret," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. The woman pulled her horse to a stop and dismounted with some difficulty, her movements suggesting that she was tired beyond measure. When she looked up at Sam, her face was streaked with tears. "Hello, Sam," she said quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding." Margaret Dalton was Jake Dalton's younger sister, a woman Sam had heard about but never expected to meet. According to the stories, she had been a schoolteacher in a small town in Kansas before her brother's criminal activities had brought shame and danger to their entire family. She had been forced to leave her home and her profession, constantly moving from place to place to avoid the violence and retribution that seemed to follow anyone connected to the Dalton name. "Margaret," Sam said again, still hardly believing that she was really there. How did you?" "I heard about what happened," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Jake, about how he died. But I also heard about what happened here, about what you and your wife did for him and his men." "Elena, huh?"